friends, welcome to Revelation to Transformation 2.1. This is the beginning of chapter 2, titled The Power of the Exchanged Life. Now, this chapter is significantly longer than the previous chapter. As I said, that previous chapter really was just working as an introduction, but this is not this is not atypical of the way the rest of the book will go. So there are a little bit lengthier chapters from here on, and we cover quite a bit of ground. I remember when I wrote this chapter, I was unfamiliar with the fact that there was even sort of a movement in the church called the Exchange Life Movement, and there is, of which I've done a lot of conferences and a lot of meetings with people associated with this Exchange Life Movement or Exchange Life Ministries and things of that nature. And I'm not specifically calling out a specific ministry. There's probably one called that, but just this sort of a subset of believers, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but just a set of believers who sort of fashion themselves around this idea of the life, the exchange life of His life for our life. It was a revelation I was walking into, independent of realizing that it was a greater thing, that it was something else. One of the things that we bring out in this chapter, and we bring it out early and often, it's really the framework for this chapter and what we're trying to accomplish, is the difference in religion as understood by most of the world, and then what we would call relationship. And that's nothing unusual now as well. In fact, most of you have probably been introduced to the message of grace through some sort of comparison between the two R's, religion and relationship. And again, that's not unique to us. Lots of people do that. But I want to make sure we clarify some things that I don't feel like we brought to the table quite effectively enough in this chapter when I wrote it. And that was the validity of what religion is. We use the phrase in this chapter to denote performance, works, and effort to achieve righteousness. It might be an unfair categorization of religion across the board, but there is utility in being able to define religion through those performance definitions, like works. When you begin to do to get, in this chapter we call that religion. In all reality, religion is from the Latin word that means to link or to bind together. So in that form, religion is a valid thing, and it is actually a necessary thing. I'm not downplaying what I think is religion's greatest contribution to the world, and that is community. It links and binds together communities, families, generations, cultures, and languages. Religious practices bring a unity to people that is found in very few other things, honestly, outside of sports. Sports kind of does that. It crosses cultures and grabs fans, fanatics that wear the jerseys and hang the banners and pay for the tickets and watch them on television. People that have nothing else in common, then linked by their love for a particular sports team. We're also in an era where it's a little bit that way nationally too. There's a sort of a rising tide of nationalism that has people sort of identifying with one country. I personally think that one's more dangerous than sports identity. Nationalism in some ways has some of the same dangers that religion does, in that it tends towards an unhealthy us versus them. Sports has an us versus them, but in a we all enjoy doing what we're doing kind of way, and we can't affect the outcome. Whereas religion and nationalism have a us versus them, we do affect the outcome. You're evil if you are the other side, whereas there's little evil in the sports analogy. So in that way, it links, unifies, and bonds people. And so religion does that. There's also a text. We didn't use it in the chapter, but I want to use it with you. And it's James chapter 1, verse 27. And James says, "Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. To visit the orphans and the widows is really the mandate of the old covenant that God gave to Israel. Take care of the strangers and the fatherless and the widows and those who don't have. Really shore up the edges so that the marginalized have a place to call home. When you do, you get to stay in the land. When you don't, you'll be conquered and you'll lose the land. And that's really God's national old covenant program, which is take care of those. Jesus comes along and really gives legs to that, shows us how to take care of them, shows us how to love our neighbor, shows us how to respond to our enemy. In such vivid color, those four Gospels are brilliant in that they lay out that kingdom mandate. They're really laying out James's definition of pure religion. Take care of the widows and the fatherless, keep yourself unspotted from the world. Now, I believe keep yourself unspotted from the world has less to do with the Spirit, because you don't keep yourself unspotted by not sinning. That would be an old covenant mentality. You keep yourself unspotted in that you do not allow the world to dictate your identity, your self-worth. You don't allow the system of the world to determine how you navigate the world. So in that sense, you are unspotted from them. I bring all of this up because I want you to see that there really is such thing as pure religion. But I also think there's impure religion. And not only is impure religion by default not taking care of the widows and the strangers and being spotted by the world, I think it is allowing that system of the world, which is do good, get good, karma, what goes around comes around. It's allowing that to define your relationship with God. That's a religion that we need to run from. Unfortunately, a lot of our Christianity has devolved into an impure religion in which it is not about taking care of the world or the people in it. It's about escaping the world. It is not about being unspotted from the world in that we don't determine ourselves through their system, but rather it's copy the system of the world and then just sort of make it holy, bring it over into the church, where we're doing in order to get God to do. We pay so God blesses us financially. We sacrifice so that God observes and honors our sacrifice. These things are impure religion. And when they are brought into our faith, when they're brought into our Christianity, it's deadly. It's a deadly mix. This is really what we're calling mixture when we call it mixture. It's not just the teaching of the old covenant mixed in with the teaching of the new. That is mixture, and we'll refer to that a lot. But mixture is also taking the beauty of pure religion, which is caring for those outside of me and making sure I don't dictate myself according to the system of the world. And it's mixing that with a self-centered gospel where I don't think as much about the outside. It's all about me, my personal relationship with Jesus, a phrase I don't like at all, because then Jesus becomes personal only instead of corporate, which is a part of who he is and what he does. And also, I think whenever religion is brought into an impure place, when we're in an impure stance with religion, not only do we make it internal and make it personal, but we also then dictate ourselves through the functions and formalities of the world, and we destroy the purity of that relationship. Relationship is the key word, and I use it to replace religion, and I'm not unique. A lot of people do that. What I mean is relationship in place of a religion of works, in which you are working your way or doing something to achieve. What we need to remember is what we're involved in is a faith in which Christ did the work so that we can receive the benefits. When we talk about the power of the exchange life, it's what he did so that I can have what he did, not what he did so that I can go copy what he did. We do copy what he did in relation to man. That's him showing us how to be human on the earth. But in his sacrificial death, burial, and resurrection, he's not asking you to die on a cross or raise from the dead. He's asking you to participate by faith in him dying on the cross and then being raised from the dead. But he said, they're going to know you're my disciples, not because you go die on crosses and raise from the dead. They're going to know you're my disciples because you love one another. So in the experience of living out our faith, we copy him, very much so. That's discipleship. In our experience of living out the resurrected life, we don't copy him. We allow him to exchange his life for ours. We make the comment early on in this chapter, I think it's second page or so into the chapter, regardless of which one of our printings you're using. We make the statement that I personally had gotten to the place in my own walk in which I was down to either, God, you're going to have to show me how I can live free, or I quit. And I came to the conclusion, I very clearly remember this happening in my walk. I came to the conclusion where the answer was not either or. It was not God's either going to have to do it or I'm quitting. The answer was actually both. God's going to have to do it and I quit doing it. And that when I got both of those put together, then I could walk into a liberty. And my encouragement to you, I think most of you are on this journey or you wouldn't be following us in this study, is that it's not a matter of either God does it or I quit. It's a matter of God's going to do it and I'm going to quit doing it. I can't change me spiritually. I can't make me more forgiven. I can't make me more righteous. I can't make me more justified and sanctified. God has to do that. And I either trust that God has done that, is doing that, and will ever do that, or I can't be forgiven, can't be righteous, can't be justified. If I trust that he's done it, is doing it, and ever shall do it, he who was, he who is to come, then I quit doing it. And the faster that I quit doing it, the quicker I come to the place where I'm no longer doing it, the easier it is to allow him to do it. And that brings us to the comparison that we make in the chapter of Old Testament versus New Testament, in that in the Old Testament, it requires a religion of sacrifice and effort, whereas in the New Testament, it's his sacrifice and his effort and then my faith. Here's an analogy I like to use. And we have a sermon that we did that I would encourage you to go look for. It's free to watch on our platforms and listen to on our podcast site, called God Provides Himself a Lamb. And I'd use that statement from the book of Genesis, where Abram and Isaac are traveling up the mountain, and Isaac says, Dad, we've got the knife, we've got the fire, we've got the wood, but where's the sacrifice? And Abram says, God shall provide himself a lamb. And that lays out the precedent for the Bible, that God's end game is to provide a lamb. Yet why then, when the law is given in Exodus, why does God lay out all of these sacrificial codes? When to kill the lamb and the goat and the bullock and the pigeon and the turtle dove? And why is temple sacrifice saturated in blood? Well, there's a lot of reasons for it, and we'll get into some of them, no doubt, as we go. And I don't want to get into all of them today, but I do want this point to be sort of central. The Old Testament is us providing a lamb. We buy it, and in some cases, we cultivate it as a pet. For instance, Passover lamb, you brought into your home and you brought it in 4 days before you killed it. And there's an indication there that God wanted them to bring it in so they'd fall in love with it, so that the atonement sacrifice for their family would be a painful one, so that they would know that sacrifice costs something, not just some random sheep you went out and bought, but that you were consuming something that you loved. It would be a prelude to Jesus, where we would consume something that we love. We're not serving him out of fear. We're not serving him out of obligation. We're following him and serving him and feasting on him and feasting with him out of love. So the Old Testament is, we do the lamb providing. But then in the New Covenant, we don't provide lambs anymore. He provides the lamb. If you needed a real succinct difference between the New Covenant and the Old Covenant, you provide. New Covenant, he provides. Now that doesn't mean that God didn't do anything in the Old Covenant. That's obvious. It also doesn't mean we don't do anything in the New Covenant. It just means that the heartbeat of what made the Old Covenant work was, if you do it, I'll do this. The heartbeat of what makes the New Covenant work is, he has done it, thus I am. And that gives us a sense of direction to understand the difference in those covenants. So I basically came to the conclusion, God made me, God's going to have to change me. And so I would encourage you, let God change what only God can change. That leads us to the first text that's actually in the chapter, and that's Romans chapter 5, verse number 12, where Paul says this in Romans 5:12. As by one man sin entered into the world, and death entered in by sin. And so we were doing that text to try to show that it's in our human nature to sin. I don't like the phrase sin nature because it makes it sound like we have this part in us that is unredeemed and unatoned for, and then we have this part in us that is atoned for, and those two are going to duke it out. The reality is that we're human. We're made from dust, and we have nature and habits that are human, and we have lusts and desires and passions that are human. And the law was to rein those passions in so that they did not breach the social contract with our neighbor, so that they did not trample his rights, his property, his possessions. That's the don't kill, the don't commit adultery, the don't steal, the don't lie. Why? Is God a killjoy? No, God is as concerned for your neighbor as he is for you. And we had to have restrictions against human nature because human nature will overrun its neighbor. But we didn't have to have an outside influence. We didn't have to have a sin nature to sin in the garden. Therefore, don't pawn off your failure on your nature and say, well, I had to do it because, that's what humans do. Adam, with no nature to sin, still sins because the external influence spoke to his humanity. And that's what happens to us. We're drawn away of our own lusts and enticed. We're drawn away of what makes us human and enticed. We compare the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, and we spend a paragraph or two in this chapter talking about the fact that Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I would add this to this thought. What the tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents is man's dependency on consciousness. And consciousness shows us the difference between good and evil, but consciousness does not give us the power to choose the difference between good and evil successfully every time. In fact, it even clouds our judgment sometimes between what is good and evil because our consciousness is closely linked to our humanity, and our humanity has lusts and passions and desires that cause us to lean towards sometimes the evil rather than the good. It has to be that way, otherwise people who we would call quote-unquote unbelievers could never do anything good. And that's not true. Good does come forth from time to time from people who don't even claim to know God. They still do or lean towards the good because it is in human consciousness to lean towards the good, also to lean towards the evil. It's not as if that's the only way to live. There's a tree of life, and the tree of life is a representation of the realm of the Spirit. It's the realm of the Eternal One. And it is what was off limits due to our sin until Jesus. Jesus shows us the gateway back into living our lives according to the dictates of the Spirit. Through Christ, we don't have to be slaves to consciousness. Through Christ, we have access to the same Holy Spirit that Jesus has access to. So the tree of life is really the tree of the spirit realm. It's the tree of being able to live according to the Spirit and not be a slave to the realm of the natural or the realm of our consciousness. I've had people ask me, do you think that as believers we can still eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? My response is you can't help but eat from it once in a while. The fact that you're human is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the tree of life is yours through Christ. You have access to that tree of life. And you might say, well, how do I know the difference? It's not a matter of parceling the difference. It's understanding that your human nature is human because of a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what you have, though, is access to a higher way, a better way, a life-giving way that is the way of the Spirit, which comes to us through Jesus Christ, His finished work, His resurrection, His ascension, His descension into us through Pentecost, through the Holy Spirit. That's my access to a higher form of living. That's what keeps me from being a slave to the system of man. It's what keeps me from being enslaved to this world. Adam has made us slaves to our conscience, but the story doesn't end there for us. Why? Because we have the man on the tree. We have Jesus on the tree. And because He's been on that tree, we are not obligated and remaining slaves of conscience. We use a text in the passage in which we quote Genesis 3:19, and we don't quote it, we allude to it. And the allude to it is we make this statement: even his day-to-day bread, talking about Adam, even his day-to-day bread would now be acquired by the sweat of his own labor, making all his spiritual blessings come by the same means. And what I mean by that is that the text tells us that he survived by the sweat of his brow. And we're really setting you up with this statement because Jesus is going to sweat great drops of blood in the garden to alleviate us from the stress of having to live by our own sweat. And so that's why I lay that out at that case in the book. So there's one more text that we use, and there'll be our closing text for today, is from Genesis chapter 3, verse 5, where the snake says to Eve, God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And the reason I bring this up is because I want you to know that Eve does not eat the fruit because Eve is rebelling against God. Eve eats the fruit because she wants to be more like God. And man leans into his consciousness not to rebel against God's way. He leans into his consciousness to do the best he can. And we've become slaves to that. Eve's sin is not, I'm going to show God. Eve's sin is that she's deceived by the serpent. The serpent says to her, if you do this, you'll be like God. What she doesn't realize is she's already like God. And all she has to do is lean into that, accept that. And we're still being lied to this day that there's more we can do to be like God. Try harder, work harder, you'll be like God. Our being like God is not found at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's found in the tree of life. It's found in what Jesus has done for us. So don't accept the lie of the serpent today. You don't need to do anything to be more like Him. You need to receive what Christ has done on your behalf to be like Him. Okay, we've just barely gotten started in this chapter, but already the framework is great for good stuff on the exchange life. And there's a lot of stuff we'll get into in the next segment where we hit some questions, we hit a lot more scripture. But for now, it's a good stopping point as it's been a good introduction to the basics of the power of the exchange life. Watch for the questions coming up. We'll have a few of them. They'll try to walk you through some of the things we talked about. And we will see you in R2T 2.2. God bless.
Bountiful blessings in